Welcome to another episode of the Do You Even Live Here podcast. My name is Preston Blakely. I'm the mayor of the town of Fletcher. I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Dalton George, the mayor of Boone, North Carolina. We're super excited to be sitting down in Asheville, North Carolina today at the Table and Mic podcast recording studio. It's an amazing studio. I think this might be the first episode that we recorded in person, Dalton. So super excited to do that. We are joined by former senator now, Graig Meyer, who's a former teacher, social worker, and state senator. He spent his career focused on making North Carolina work better for everyday people. He recently stepped into a new role as executive director of the North Carolina Justice Center, where he's leading efforts around public education, economic opportunity, and fairness across our state. He's also the founder of Beacon Media, which pays the bills for the Do You Even Live Here podcast. So shout out to Graig Meyer on that. And we're proud to partner with them on this show. So this conversation feels like a full circle moment. Graig's seen these issues from just about every angle on the ground in schools and the legislature, and now leading both policy and storytelling efforts across North Carolina. So I'm really excited to be digging in on what he's seeing right now and where he thinks we're headed. And we've actually got a special addition to the conversation, Dalton, so I'll let you introduce.
Yeah, next up we've got Kym Meyer, the other half of the Meyer power couple. And I've got to tell you, Preston, I was really excited to know that Kym was going to join us here in the studio as the Litigation Director for the Southern Environmental Law Center, a real rock star across the South in terms of environmental work, preservation, conservation, which is really near and dear to my heart. As I was preparing for this episode, I was like, man, I might ice out Graig and Preston and go on a rogue streak, but I'll try not to. But we're super excited to have both of y'all here in Asheville today.
We're so glad to join y'all. We love Asheville. We love Western North Carolina. This is great.
Yeah, and thank you for being here, Graig and Kym. Appreciate y'all making the trip to hang out with Dalton and I.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
And so I want to tee up a couple of the topics we're going to be talking about as we get ready for our first segment. And so we've got a little bit about leaving the legislature, which is the main topic. You're probably used to that conversation by now, Graig, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a bit about the roadless rule and other environmental concerns for Western North Carolina and North Carolina as a whole, and get Kym's perspective, as well as talk about some of our work and how that connects. And then we're going to talk about really communication. I've been really impressed with Graig's Substack and him taking a lot of what's going on across the country to task and having real honest conversations and this authentic approach to this really unique political environment that we're in. And then last, we're going to wrap up with some fun things. We'll see how that goes. I know Jeremy's watching. Shout out Jeremy, whose blood pressure is up as we're in the studio without him.
Jeremy Borden.
Yeah, Jeremy Borden.
Executive Director of Beacon Media.
Exactly. And so we'll have some fun topics for Jeremy's benefit as well.
We'll kick it off with you, Graig. And I'll say this is super special. And I'm curious about the Asheville connection, too, because we'll talk about that. Because this is my first time being in the presence of the great Graig Meyer. But coincidentally, I've been in the presence of your dad several times. And I met your dad before I met you. And I think the first interaction that we ever had, Graig, I was at former Representative Joe Sam Queen's house. And if you've been to the house now.
Joe Sam's front porch.
Joe Sam's front porch, that's right. And I was on his front porch, and I'm there shaking hands, kissing babies, and one of the hands I'm shaking is your dad's. And we get to talking, and he's, oh, yeah, my son's in politics, too. And I'm like, okay, who's your son? He's like, Graig Meyer. I was like, Graig Meyer? That's not casual. That's a big deal. And I think I proceeded to actually shoot you a DM. And I'm like, hey, I just met your dad, and I know this is super random, and he says you're doing this work with this city of Asheville, Asheville City Schools, Asheville High School. I think it was the Racial Equity Ambassadors Program.
That's right.
And so you're working with some young people. I think you actually gave credit to somebody else in your team that you said was really spearheading that work. Again, super excited to be here with this conversation with you, Graig.
Say more about that Asheville work as we're downtown Asheville, because I didn't know about any of this, or the fact that your dad is like part PR for the Graig Meyer name.
Yeah, and I think the last time I saw his dad, I was just finishing up a keynote, and I took a selfie, and I'm like, Graig, I'm with your dad again.
Yep.
Graig's dad's everywhere.
Yeah, so I moved to North Carolina in 98, and from Cleveland, Ohio, where I grew up, and I've been coming here since probably fall of 98, early 1999 to Asheville. So I've had a long relationship. I love Asheville. I love Western North Carolina. Today we were all the way out at the Joyce-Kilmer Forest, all nearly out to Murphy. Like the farther west you go, the more beautiful it gets out here. But my parents bought a vacation house here so that they could have a chance to meet up with our family, and that was probably around 2002, 2003. So they've been coming here for a long time, and now they've settled here. They're retired. They're living here in Asheville, and my parents were both incredibly politically active. when we lived in Cleveland, and they've just transferred that here. So that's why you see them at all the events. Both my dad and my mom are going to all the things and trying to keep the progressive spirit of Western North Carolina alive. And then the work that I was doing here in Asheville was part of my education consulting work. The Asheville City Schools Foundation has this amazing youth-driven leadership program called the Racial Equity Ambassadors Program. These kids do so many incredible things. They train their teachers on how to be better teachers. They lead community dialogue about how to have a more inclusive community. They do deep dive work with the Black community here in Asheville. And yeah, our work, myself and my colleague Bettina Umstead, we did a number of years of work with those students with helping them with something that called the Asheville 6, which was a set of 6 strategies that the students identified that they wanted their teachers to use more, to be more effective and more inclusive in the classrooms. And it was so effective. What the kids did was so amazing that the school district actually adopted those 6 strategies from the students as their instructional framework for the entire school system.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty good work.
Yeah, that's incredible. I got a chance to meet with the students at one point. So this was a couple years ago. I went and talked to the group of kids, and they're just incredibly brilliant. And just to your point, the work they're doing is really making a meaningful impact in the city schools. But hopefully when they leave school and graduate, they're still making that same impact. I got a chance to do some scholarship interviews at Asheville High the other day, and I'll say these kids are probably much smarter than I was at their age. Their resumes were incredibly long. Their GPAs were very high. Mine was not that high. My resume was not that long, but future's bright. But nevertheless, Graig, we really want to dig into, thank you for the Asheville connection, but we really want to dig into you. And you've been a state senator for a long time. I want to hear about how you got into that role, and then you just left. So why now? Why'd you leave, and how'd you get into it?
I got into the legislature through my advocacy for public schools, and I really thought going in that I would be a person who would focus almost completely on public schools. A very common piece of advice you get when you enter the legislature is pick the one thing you want to focus on and really try and dive deep in that. It turns out that I became a generalist rather than a specialist. I certainly did plenty of schools work, but worked on just about every issue that you can focus on, which is what set me up to go to the Justice Center, because I'm really interested in how all policies interconnect and how you have to get all the things right to really deliver a livable, supportive place with opportunity for people. And by the time I was there 12 years and was ready to leave and take on this opportunity at the Justice Center, my dream job, one of the things that I realized was that when I first got there, I thought, I'm going to go there because I can make the difference. I can do the thing. You're the person in the seat. And it's true, there's nothing like having the power. You guys know that as a mayor, like nobody else is the mayor of your town. But no matter who you are, as well-intentioned as you are always subject to forces from the public. You have to respond to the people that you represent. And one of the things that was the most disappointing to me inside the legislature were the times that people who I knew had values that should direct them towards the right thing would end up doing the wrong thing because they were responding to pressures rather than values. And what that meant to me was that we have to create a way of organizing the public where we create pressures so that legislators and other elected officials are always thinking about people first. And if you're not thinking about people first, if you're thinking about corporations or industry or whatever it is, then you are really not doing the people's business. But I understand why. When the pressures come at you, you can make some compromised decisions.
Yeah, the court of public opinion.
That's it. And so that's why we need people, regular working people, organized and putting pressure on elected officials.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I often call back to my background, my family, and I do janitorial work, and that's not the type of person that you typically see in these elected positions. And I think so often we get folk that are just so disconnected from the folk that are rooted in their communities that you don't really know what's going on. And I would imagine it's particularly easy to get maybe unrooted when you're in Raleigh, especially if you're coming from a place like this. Dalton and I talk a lot about this. You go to any given grocery store or the gym or just out at a restaurant, as mayors, you're talking to your constituents.
That's right.
They're going to approach you and they're going to talk about the things that they care about and their values. And so I'd imagine you all didn't really have that same experience. At least I think in part you all did, but maybe not particularly the same experience as Dalton and I, would you say?
My favorite part of public service was being with people in the community, because I'm a social worker, and so like that connection to who are the people, that motivation of where are you serving has been part of my professional career as a social worker and then part of my political career. And I always think that I'm there, especially because I was in the minority as a Democrat in the North Carolina General Assembly. My whole purpose of being there was not to make the policies, because the majority got to do that, but was to speak up for the people who the policies were not addressing.
Right.
And that could be working people like janitors, it could be immigrants, it could be LGBTQ people, whoever it was. Like, if you're pushing this policy and it is abusing the people that I represent, then my job was to speak up for them. And I do think that it does make a difference if you have people that have that type of connection and perspective. I think a lot of the reason why bad policies get made is because people don't have the relationship and don't see how things are actually impacting people. And Preston, to credit you, I think that piece that you wrote, it was called Vacuums and Gavels.
Yeah.
I think that is one of the best things that I've ever seen written about how it matters when you represent from the position of working people rather than representing from the position of business owners or capitalists or billionaires or whatever it is. And I hope more people read that piece that you write, and I hope more janitors run for office.
Yeah. You said something really interesting earlier, Graig, about this kind of misalignment from the public's values for these elected officials. And as you're leaving the legislature, I think it's important to know, how much were you getting paid as a senator?
$13,951 a year. And you get a per diem on top of that. You basically end up making about $35,000 a year to do it. And so what does that mean? That means that you have a General Assembly, which is supposed to be a part-time body made up of that any working person could be there. But you basically only have three types of people. You have people who are independently wealthy, you have people who are retired, and you have people that own their own business or can bill hourly, which is what I was a consultant, so that was the category that I fit into. But there's very few people you can't do it if you got a 9-to-5 job.
Yeah. And especially, I think there's another layer to it being from Western North Carolina, right?
The commute.
It's a long ways away to try 4 hours from Fletcher or Asheville or Boone to Raleigh. There's that whole another layer, right? I get paid, I don't know how much you get paid, Dalton, or if you get paid at all, but I get paid $12,000 a year to be mayor, and I'll have people ask me if I'm ever going to run for the legislature, and I'm like, it feels like a step down almost. It's like, I don't have a lot of power here. I'm a
Mayors
mayor.
don't have a lot of power.
We don't have a lot of power here, but I'm effective with these people in my community, and we're getting things done. But if I were to go to Raleigh, which I don't think I could win anyways, I'm going to go down there and be in a minority. I'm going to spend pretty much all my time in Raleigh. The short session doesn't really feel like a short session anymore. I just feel like it just keeps on going and going.
That's right.
I want to get down there, and I'm just going to get railroaded. And I'm like, I can build a downtown in Fletcher, but I go to Raleigh, I'm not sure I'll be able to pass any effective policy to really impact my community.
That's right. And in some ways, if you want the most powerful position in North Carolina besides being in the majority in Raleigh, but go be a county commissioner. County commissioners have a lot of money to spend. They influence a lot of local things. There's many ways to be of service and make a difference. Ultimately, I didn't feel like I was making enough of a difference in the General Assembly. Kym and I were looking for ways. Kym always talks about the highest best purpose directive, and it got to the point where it was not my highest best purpose to be spinning my wheels on things in Raleigh where I wasn't going to be able to get what I wanted, nor was I going to be able to stop the bad things from happening. And in shorthand, I want to switch from playing defense to offense, and that's what I feel like I have the chance to do at the North Carolina Justice Center, because we advocate across pretty much every progressive issue area, and we have every tool in the toolkit: litigation, lobbying, research, communications. And so we have the chance to try and push this state in a different direction. And instead of having to split my time between consulting and legislating, now I can be full time on what do the people of North Carolina need and how do we get there.
That was my reason to even ask the pay question, is to paint this picture of the General Assembly, which is in this really interesting place where I think that's what's led to this misalignment of community values, is a lot of these folks are already in positions personally where they're insulated from the public, right? There's this amount of privilege, and as they go to Raleigh, I can just vote with party leadership because I'm in a comfortable place already, and I'm not out amongst my community.
I don't think very many people go to the General Assembly to get rich. I can name some people who have, Tim Moore, but I think many people go for status, and some people go for power. Now, I didn't want the status, didn't care about the status. I went for power, but I never got the power that I wanted to have. And so the best I could do was service. I could represent people and I could try to speak up for them. But I'm in the world of public service for the purpose of building power and making a difference for people. And so that's why it's, to me, a higher best purpose calling to move on rather than staying there, even though the status of being a senator is a thing, but I'm happy to leave it behind in order to build power.
I'm curious, so thinking back on your first day in the legislature, what's the most surprising thing about Democrats that you've learned?
It's difficult to say, but I think it's true for both Democrats and Republicans, but it goes back to what I said earlier. I would like to believe that Democrats were all my allies all the time, but they're not. Every member of the legislature is independently elected, and you can't depend on anyone to do the thing that even they say is the right thing to do if they feel like they have competing pressures to do something different. Now, 90% of the time, Democrats are on the same page about things, but when people would abdicate their values for political expediency is always a difficult conversation. And honestly, there were times where I understood that and supported that. Or you got to keep your seat. We can't afford to have you take this vote. But there were other times where people were I just feel like I got to do this thing, and for not having a clear values-driven reason, but political reasons. And so I was more disappointed by Democratic colleagues than I was by Republican colleagues, because I never expected Republican colleagues to do the right thing. But when Democratic colleagues would do the wrong thing, it would be disappointing. And I think Kym is an advocate in the environmental space, and you all as advocates for small towns, Western North Carolina, I think anybody who advocates see this. If you're a consistent advocate for values-based things that should impact people, then you know there are times where the folks who you believe and have good reason to believe should be with you, where they're not with you. Yeah. And that's always, that was consistently the hardest thing.
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Kym, I was just wondering, pulling you in, how do you feel, right? Having Graig transition out of the legislature, that's going to be a change to y'all's dynamic as this kind of notable couple in North Carolina.
Yeah, relieved and excited. I would say the best thing so far is he has been waking up at 5 a.m. every morning, so excited about his job, which is a real change from what it's been like with the legislature, which has been so frustrating. And both of us, we care so much about making a difference and how can we best use our time, how can we best use our talents and balance all of that with our family. And this just seems like it's going to be much more effective. So I'm really excited. SELC actually represents the Justice Center as a client in energy dockets, and I've co-counseled with Justice Center attorneys in the past, so I think it's a really exciting potential for collaboration, but I don't know. It's like the world is wide open.
Well,
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love that. That brings me to another question I have. What happens behind the scenes in the Meyer household? What else are y'all working together on? Because y'all are quite the quintessential power couple, to say the least. Are there particular things y'all working together on in the background?
We bought a house that is great for entertaining, and we use that both for our kids and our family, but also really for building community. And we've been really intentional about that since we moved in there. And that's everything from political fundraisers. We probably won't be doing so much of that anymore, but we do a lot of nonprofit fundraisers. And then we just do things like bringing folks together. So last weekend, we had our annual brunch celebration where I actually raised from seed about 4,000 plants. So eggplant, tomatoes, chilies, and we invite a whole bunch of people, and they donate, and that money goes to the local food pantry in Chapel Hill Porch. So we love doing things like that. We work together I'm on the board of Beacon Media, so Jeremy and Graig and I have been working on that for, 4 years now. Yep. And then we had a really fun collaboration while Graig was in the legislature that I hope he'll still stay engaged in, which came about while we were in Atlanta on a trip, and we were, I think, going for a walk. And I don't know if you've been on the Beltline in Atlanta.
I've not been.
But it was a highway, and it was going to be a highway, so it had this whole area cleared, and they turned it into a long running path, but also has housing and shops and all of this. So we started thinking, we'd been working for a little while on trying to retire the coal-fired power plant in Chapel Hill.
The university runs on this coal-fired power plant.
Okay.
So there's a rail line that goes from that power plant about 15 miles till it meets up with the main track. The only thing that rail line does is carry coal. So we started thinking, what if they didn't need to take coal anymore because they would transition this to a cleaner power plant? What could we do with this corridor? Could we transform it into this walking, biking track, but also it goes past all this land that could be used for affordable workforce housing? You could boost economic development. So that's a project which, great point of like the power that Graig did have in his old position. He could pull in county commissioners, mayors, and then SELC, we pulled in other partners, and we started to build this big collaboration and visioning process. And that's now underway in a very formal process through the local transportation planning organization. So that was a real fun one.
And the university, like everybody's on board moving in the same direction. If you close down the power plant or you convert, you don't have to close it down, but you convert it from coal to other sources of power, then you close down the rail line, then how do you change the rail line into a greenway that can become an economic development opportunity, can open up housing opportunities, can be recreation? Like, you guys as mayors get this. Like the town of Carborough, which is about the same size as either of your towns, like the rail line goes right through downtown, and the rail line itself prohibits a ton of development just because of the spacing. So how do you do that? But I want to say one more thing to answer your question about what happens in the Meyer household, which is when you have a true partner and you're talking about what's happening in your day-to-day lives, we're always talking about each other's work and where there's overlap and where there's not. But to me, when I was in the legislature, one of the most important things was there are difficult, complex decisions to make when you're in the legislature. How do you have only a yes or no vote on something that's a very complex bill? Which way are you going to land on it? And so having Kym as a partner and thinking through those things was very influential to me in some of the most difficult moments, right? Thinking about the night before at home, talking about where am I going to land? What are we going to emphasize here? But then getting even to the moment where you have to push the button and having all of the voices in your head of which way do I go at this time on the vote. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, who do I want to emphasize? And to having one person who is like always there saying, this is what your values are, so where are you going to land on your values? Which is not to say, I mean, she's very understanding of say, I can't land 100% here this time, but having somebody that keeps you true is so important when you're facing all of those external pressures.
And it's tough to unravel your thoughts in a public way, right? As a public official, you got to be careful who you're talking to when you're dealing with these tough votes. And so having a partner that can be that person that's that kind of vault for you, like even for me as mayor, it's been invaluable.
That's right.
You practice a little bit.
Right. Absolutely. The last thing I want to ask as we're wrapping up the leaving the legislature, because y'all were talking about this before the show, but I doubt you've been able to hike a lot since you were a senator, and y'all were sharing that you were able to hike a little bit and get outside in Western North Carolina. You've got an event tomorrow as well, so would love to hear a little bit more about that exploration and what's going on tomorrow, Monday.
Yeah, I mean, we're both up here for work because Southern Environmental Law Center has an office up here, so Kym's up here to meet with her office and the Justice Center. We have a meet and greet here in Asheville tomorrow, and I'm also meeting with some of our partners at Pisgah Legal Services, a couple of our board members. Southern Environmental Law Center is a multi-state, 7-state organization. Kym works all over the Southeast. The Justice Center is a statewide organization. And I think that a lot of people consider us to be a Raleigh-focused organization because you know about the public policy work that we do. Other people know a lot about the litigation work that we do, and of course the courts can often end up in Raleigh as well. But the truth is we're trying to represent people from all across North Carolina, and it's very important to me to know what's happening in local communities so that we can raise the voices of people, advocate for priorities. And especially given what Western North Carolina has been through since Helene, and like tomorrow we're going to meet with Pisgah Legal Services, like where are we with housing security in Western North Carolina? How is that impacting economic security and opportunity? What role should the Justice Center be playing to bridge what's happening out here to what our ability is to impact policy in Raleigh? And what are you focused on here in Western North Carolina tomorrow?
I was lucky enough that Southern Environmental Law Center has our annual retreat up in Montreat. So I started my week there, which was a mixture of work and hiking, and we actually got to partner with Mountain True and put in a whole bunch of trees along the side of creeks that are recovering from Helene. So that was the start of my Western North Carolina weekend. But then, it has been a while since we've gotten the chance to have 2 hikes in one weekend. So we hiked in the Rough Creek in Canton, and then we were out at Joyce Kilmer today, and the wildflowers are amazing. But tomorrow I'm just meeting with all of our litigators that we have in Asheville. They're all doing incredible work, and part of my job is just to support everyone, hear about what they're working on, see what I can do to further help them. And this is a really difficult political moment, and so there's extra need for that personal attention and just, are you okay conversations. And so that's what I'll be doing tomorrow.
I'll say I deeply appreciate y'all being up in Western North Carolina. I was teasing y'all before we got on the mic. Y'all didn't say Fletcher, which is disappointing. But listen, there's still time. If you don't make it out to Fletcher, you can go out to Henderson County, which I want to give a shout out to the city of Hendersonville and the city of Brevard and Henderson County, Transylvania County. They worked on the Acoustic Trail, which kind of sounds similar to the work y'all are talking about.
Yeah.
So that Rails and Trails program, I'm not sure if that's exactly what y'all are doing.
It's exactly, yep.
There you go. And so if y'all get a chance to get outside more and walk, go to the Acoustic Trail, y'all. It's a good place to be. And so
that was segment 1 of Do You Even Live Here? We've got Preston Blakely and Dalton George as the hosts, and we're talking with Graig Meyer and Kym Meyer a little bit about leaving the legislature in this first section. And for the next segment, we'll talk to Kym and really laser focus on some climate issues, biodiversity issues, and talk a little bit about the roadless rule. Thanks for being here, y'all. Welcome back, everybody, to Do You Even Live Here? I'm Dalton George, one of your hosts. I'm also the mayor of Boone, North Carolina. I'm here with my co-host, Preston Blakely, the mayor of Fletcher. And today we're talking to Graig Meyer, a former North Carolina senator coming into the North Carolina Justice Center as their executive director, and his partner and wife, Kym Meyer, who is the litigation director for the Southern Environmental Law Center. And for folks that know me, they know I work for the Endangered Species Coalition, so collaborate a lot with SELC, near and dear to my heart. We're in the same world. And before we dive into some talk about critters or climate or whatever else, the 2 C's, I do want to just learn a little bit more about you, Kym. And so originally from England, came here to the States and became an environmental lawyer. But tell us a little bit about that journey, because there's a lot of steps in between.
Sure, yeah. So my grandmother actually just passed away a couple of weeks ago, and so I've been thinking about this background a lot because it really started with her. She, from probably the age of 3 or so, would take me on walks looking for wildflowers and butterflies, and this was on the verges of the meadows in England, and that's where I really started to love the natural world. And over time, her and my dad and me, this was what we would do every vacation, would go searching, and we'd identify all the wildflowers. And so as I got into school, in elementary school, I formed the first nature club and then just progressed from there. It was a real focus of mine in high school, and that was a moment where really climate change was something we were really starting to think and learn about. It's actually pretty depressing for me to think about how hopeful we were about solutions back then, 30 plus years ago. But so then I went to college to study environmental science, and back then that wasn't really a very common major. It was a pretty new area. And I went to the University of East Anglia, which was the place, not just to study environmental science, but really to study climate change. And so we looked at climate change from all sorts of perspectives, the physics and oceanography and things like that, but also what I was more drawn to, which was the human side, the politics side, the solutions side. So then, complicated story from then, but my ex-husband was American. We met during a study abroad in Brazil, strangely enough. But so I ended up in California and graduated and wanted to put my environmental degree to use. So started volunteering. I worked as a community organizer for an environmental nonprofit focused on the San Diego River for a couple of years, and really that was the point where I started to think, okay, this is great. I love working with people. I love helping get people to pick up trash and paint murals and whatever, but I want to do something bigger than that. And climate change was really on my mind, particularly having just moved to the US, where it really seemed like nobody cared too much at all. And so I decided to go to law school. I looked around, and the people I saw in positions of power who I thought could make a difference all had law degrees. And so when I went to law school, it was really with that in mind. It was just like, okay, this will be a good education and it'll help elevate you and give you more power. I think I thought of myself as more of a policy-based person at that point, and went to Georgetown for law school, which is just such a phenomenal place for environmental law. There's a lot of adjunct faculty working on environmental issues. It was the year that Barack Obama was elected president, so it was a really hopeful, exciting time. One of my professors went over to work for him on climate policy. We thought, this is the moment we're going to get movement. And during my time in law school, I also started to get a little taste for litigation, which then led me to be hired at Southern Environmental Law Center in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I had never been to North Carolina. I had never been to the South. So this was a huge jump for me. But what I was thinking of, in lines with what Graig said earlier about highest best purpose, highest best use of my time, I thought, I don't need to go back to California and be an environmental lawyer. They have a lot of environmental lawyers in California, but in the South, there's a lot of help that is needed to work on these issues. And as soon as I joined SELC, I saw that I could make a real impact very quickly. And it became clear that if I wasn't there doing the work, no one else would be. And I think that's like the best feeling you can have as someone who wants to make change.
Yeah. And one of the things you said earlier was there was such optimism, right? Also, it's a depressing world now. And you on the legal side, and I work on biodiversity issues more so than climate, but there's a lot of attacks on both the climate front, on the biodiversity front. And it can be really tough spiritually, mentally, just to deal with this kind of slew of attacks and dismantling of bedrock environmental protections. And you're on the front line of that. And I noticed you smiled a lot through your story and story itself. So how do you find that joy and that optimism to keep going in a fight against these interests that are much bigger than you? I see it all the time in my world, people getting burnt out.
Yeah, and there is a lot of scholarship about how people who work on climate do burn out really quickly, and that's because even at the best of times, it is such a huge issue, and you can't really see the progress you have made. Okay, you personally are not going to bring CO2 down by any sort of meaningful number, and so people get really overwhelmed by the size of the problem and by the fact that people don't seem to care enough, and that we seem to be moving backwards. And unlike working on, if you work on, say, clean water, and you're stopping pollution into this little community, you can feel really connected with that community and really good about it. It's a little bit different working on climate. You're essentially working for the entire world.
Right.
So how do you find that personal connection? And that's something that, as a litigator, has been really great because we do get to work with groups. The way that Southern Environmental Law Center works is we're essentially a law firm, and then we represent smaller organizations or individuals as our clients. So the past year and a half has been particularly challenging in the environmental world, but what has kept me going and kept me smiling is all the partnerships and people that we are working with.
Yeah.
And that keeps your cup overflowing.
Yeah.
Kim, I'm curious as you talk about those partnerships, and as we sit in Western North Carolina, we've already talked about just how Western North Carolina was ravaged during Hurricane Helene. And at one point, when I was in grad school working on my MPA, I had an environmental class, and we were talking about how people had this framework, this mindset that Western North Carolina would have all these climate refugees because we're supposed to be this climate oasis in North Carolina, maybe in America. And I think Hurricane Helene showed us that is apparently not the case, right? Because that's not supposed to happen in West North Carolina. We're miles and miles away from any ocean. And interestingly enough, as you talk about those partnerships, one of the things that I was reading about after Hurricane Helene happened was the hurricane that impacted, and I forget the name of it, so I apologize, the hurricane that impacted Puerto Rico, I believe. And one of the interesting things that I learned was that there were these really high-powered law firms that were taking on this really risky litigation. And the litigation was that they were going to sue like the oil companies for the damage that they did to the environment. And these local governments were partnering with these law firms to essentially sue like BP or Amoco or whatever and say, you're responsible for the things that happen in our communities and you need to pay for what happened in our communities. And have you heard much about that? Do you have any thoughts about that? And it's a really new piece of litigation, so I know there's not a whole lot there, but I've been really interested in like how that's going to end up happening or going in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I have very complicated feelings about litigation like that. I am known for and pride myself on like bold, different, new legal theories. I love to do that. At the same time, I always want to make impact and not just do something that's going to look really exciting but not actually move the ball forward. And I think it's complicated, but it depends on the venue and it depends on state court versus federal court. Some of these types of cases, I think, have been a bit of a big splash. And some are, especially the ones brought in state court under state constitutions, I think have a lot of merit to them. But either way, I think there's so many different ways with litigation we can be pushing the climate agenda forward. I'm on the page of, so long as it's smart and it's not going to set us back in any way, then we should try all the things that we can.
It's a good example of where you need good policy and good litigation, because you can't sue over something that isn't law. And so if you haven't created good policy, like this is why the state courts come in, like some states have better environmental laws than other.
That's a really interesting thing about the moment we're in right now. All our environmental laws were made in the 1970s. That was the time for environmental law.
Right.
Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, National Environmental Policy Act. It was potentially an analog of the moment we're in now, but we didn't have climate change back then. We had environmental injustice, but we didn't talk about it. So we, in this moment in 2026 and beyond, we really need new legal tools as well as smart, creative litigators.
And what's so incredible about that is you're right. All of these bedrock environmental regulations started in the 70s, and really all of the efforts to change them have been to weaken them. There's not really been any revisit to these bedrock environmental regulations to strengthen them and give litigators the tools necessary. And you think about something like the Endangered Species Act, which is what I'm so focused on, and every piece of legislation, every kind of maneuvering of the Endangered Species Act since 1973 was to create release valves, was to create ways to undermine the science. And we've seen that with every other piece of legislation. And I think this segues really well into a piece that you wrote, Graig, and you were asking Senator Cooper, or soon to be Senator Cooper, I'm manifesting, I believe in manifesting, to keep climate front and center. And climate change is such an abstract thing. To your point earlier, it's hard to show people that you're moving the needle. I feel the same way about the biodiversity crisis, right? We're losing species more than we ever have before. It's hard to make people feel like they're moving the needle as individuals, as organizers, as politicians, as mayors. And so what would you say to decision makers and to individuals on how do you keep pushing the envelope and tackle climate change and biodiversity in a time where politicians are saying, maybe I won't talk about climate change. Maybe I'll talk about how we just need to like this planet more and just keep it abstract like that.
Yeah, this is the thing that I get more frustrated about than anything. And you mentioned Helene. Our current Governor Stein is very focused on Helene. That is great.
Right.
I am very glad he's focused on it. He never talks about climate change. He never mentions it. And so we're starting to divorce this major crisis, which was attributable to climate change, from the fact that we're also making it worse.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can ever get good policy or move the state or the country forward on these issues unless you name the disasters when they happen. And if you run and hide from that, then I don't know how you're ever going to move folks forward. So that's where I would start, is let's just be honest. But then there are also I think it should be easy right now, right? Energy affordability goes hand in hand with climate relief. We're seeing, luckily, Graig and I and our one son who has a car, we all have electric cars. We're not that worried about the gas prices going up right now.
Yeah.
There are so many ways where all of these things can work together. Same with correcting environmental injustice. All of these things can work in tandem. Like Graig was saying about how all policies interrelate to each other. Housing is the same thing. But you've got to be honest about it, and you've got to call it what it is.
Yeah.
That piece that you mentioned was an endorsement of Governor Cooper to become Senator Cooper, but also included 3 things that we want to see him lead on, because this goes back to why I'm leaving the legislature. Is I want political leaders to lead. One of the things that Kym and I share opinions on, and that is a hallmark to Beacon Media, is that we think that leadership requires you not to say what's already popular. It's to make popular what needs to be said. And so when you have a political leader like a Governor Cooper or Governor Stein who is doing the right thing but not saying what needs to be said, then they are failing at one aspect of their leadership. Because we have to bring the public with us to understand the urgency of something like the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis. Just addressing the affordability crisis won't ever get you to the next stage of climate policy like we were talking about. And to think that I can only do one thing because my polling shows me that right now all anybody wants to talk about is affordability, that's a failure of political leadership. You can talk about more than one thing. You can use, as Kym just said, you can use the thing that people want to talk about, affordability, to bridge to talk to the things that they need to talk about. And our best political leaders do those things.
Yeah.
To your point, Kym, and I'm Dalton, I'm going to ask you a question too. If you've talked about climate change, as we talked about Hurricane Helene, because I had a similar experience, Kym, where all the leaders in Henderson County, we all got together and we had this brainstorm and this reflection about what happened during Hurricane Helene. We were trying to figure out, and God forbid it happen again. We hope it doesn't. We truly don't know now.
Yeah.
And we were having this brainstorm session, and I was the person, and I was like, we have to talk about climate change. Are we doing any climate mapping? Are we doing any of the things that we can do to prevent this from happening again and protecting our residents? And it was like a needle dropped in the room, and like it was just silent, and nobody wanted to talk about it, and it was just glossed over. And they were like, yeah, maybe we can do that. Maybe we can do some climate mapping, but it hasn't happened. And so, Dalton, I'm curious, have you had those same conversations? Has the experience been the same for you? And I guess, Graig, you too, and all of us in our respective spaces.
Yeah, I always try to contextualize Boone in this bigger picture and show that all of these things are interconnected. As I've talked about climate, Boone is unique in the sense that we're represented by Republicans in pretty much every rung of the government besides our governor, right? And so there's this challenge where we don't have state reps or state senators that we can maybe be as honest as we'd like to be, just given the political polarization. And I've talked about climate and also recognize that there's some people that the moment you say climate change to them, they're like, I'm not interested in continuing this conversation. It is this Chicken Little, the sky is falling, that's really frustrating to me as somebody that sees the rebuild and sees getting funding as Boone as how can we ensure that we're being climate resilient in this rebuild? We're not just going to put everything back the way that it was and say this was a 100-year storm or 200-year storm and George Bush mission accomplished behind us, right? And say that this is going to come again, that this is likely to come again because of the impacts that we've had on the environment. And also, you've got to have folks that are willing to have that conversation with you. And a lot of times I'm like you, where you bring that up in the room and it goes silent. And that's troubling. And I think a lot of times local officials try to exonerate themselves from climate change. And as a quick aside, because I like to tell the story, I don't think I've ever told it in a podcast, but you and I actually were on this panel, Preston. You might remember this. But the question was, how do you as a local official deal with climate change? And the first person that was up, and it's tough to always be first on a panel, basically said, I'm a local elected official. I don't deal with climate change. That should be a state issue. You should talk to Congress about that. And then I came up and I was like, I felt very bad because I respect this person, but I had to be like, I think that should be one of your main focuses, especially if you're somewhere like Boone where you're a watershed and a headwater community. And I talked about how Boone was the first carbon neutral town in the South, right? That we were really aggressive in doing that at a municipal operation level, but how we're trying to restore habitat and increase biodiversity. And also that I recognize that Boone could do all of that and climate change is still going to happen and the extinction crisis is going to happen. But that defeatist attitude is
Yeah.
exactly why we're here.
I have such a similar story to that is so for a long time at Southern Environmental Law Center, my main focus was transportation. And if you didn't know, transportation is the leading cause of climate change in the United States and in North Carolina. It contributes hugely to greenhouse gases. So we were always pushing the Department of Transportation to focus on this. And I was in a room with the secretary, deputy secretaries of transportation, and exact same statement. The Department of Transportation is not responsible for climate change. And I just lost my mind. The idea at that point, and this was under Governor Cooper, was that this is a Department of Environmental Quality issue. No, this is something we all have to care about.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, talking about like the 100-year floodplain, and we don't want to rebuild in these same places where people lost everything. And I get frustrated when, to your point, Dalton, we talk about the 100-year floodplain, and they're like, this is a 1% chance of happening in a given year. That's a 30% chance in 30 years, and I'm 31 years old, and I don't really like those chances of it happening again when I'm 61 years old. I don't want to deal with this ever again. We have real tangible things where we can really chip away at climate change and really make a difference in our own individual communities, like the work that you're doing in Boone.
And the challenge I would give to local leaders is that when you do those things, or individuals in their community, you create that saliency and you push your elected officials to do the same. Don't have this attitude that it's not local, because it percolates up.
There are certain things that take all of us. You would not hear a local elected official say, we don't have any responsibility for racial justice. We don't have any responsibility for economic equality. That's the Federal Reserve. Give me a break. All of these things take all of us. And Dalton, kudos to you for being willing to make the disagreement publicly, because it is through disagreement that you persuade people to think differently. Think about Kym's role as a litigator in court. She has to stand there against opposing counsel to try and persuade the judges to think the way that she wants them to think. When you do that in a public forum, you are trying to win the court of public opinion. Yeah. And if you don't agree, if you don't disagree, and you say, my good friend and I here, we agree on so many things, and you try to downplay it, then you're not winning the argument. You're not moving the public. You're failing at your public duty.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we wrap up this segment of Do You Even Live Here, we're going to come back and talk about communicating to build a better movement.
All right. My name is Preston Blakely. I'm the mayor of the town of Fletcher. I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Dalton George, the mayor of Boone. And this is the Do You Even Live Here podcast. And we have two wonderful guests today, the wonderful Graig and Kym Meyer. We just wrapped up talking about the environment, which is a great conversation. And around the environment, around a lot of policies that we've been talking about today, it's always communication. And Graig, I would say that you're one of the better communicators in the Democratic Party. So, one, how did you build the way that you communicate? Because I get on Facebook and I see these really long posts that you also post on Substack, and there are people from all across North Carolina checking it out. How did that start? How did you figure out your communication style? And are there best practices that we need to do as Democrats?
You're very kind, and I've got my Democratic hat put away now that I'm at the North Carolina Justice Center. But I still think that all of the elements of persuasive communication are things that elected officials need to know, that advocacy leaders need to know, and there are themes. And I believe that right now the currency of the day is a combination of moral clarity and emotional authenticity. People want to know what you believe, and they want to know how strongly you feel about it. And interestingly, you can look at political leaders across both parties that are good at the combination of those two things. It in part explains why the president is the president right now, is because I disagree with his moral clarity, but he's very clear about it and he delivers it with emotional authenticity. And that is the place where I always start. And I've done a lot of different communication methods over time. And there was a time during the beginning of COVID, I was doing a live Facebook broadcast every night for 30 minutes to an hour to try and help people navigate what was happening in the local government, and that the medium was the right medium for the moment. But since the 2024 elections, on my public presence of long form writing really came about, and it was, behind the scenes, and people who know us know this, it was published under Graig Meyer's name, but that was a full-on Kym and Graig Meyer collaborative project that was every week for about a year and a half trying to process what was our true emotional reaction to what was happening in the country and the world that week, and to try to look over the horizon and give people a sense of hope, of if we could just do these things, we can get past this stage. If we can organize in this way, if we can build pressure in this way. And often what would happen would be we would talk about ideas and then I would just write as much as I could. And often it was a cathartic experience of unloading a lot of negativity. And then Kym would come in and she would say, hey, we talked about these things that you didn't even put in here, which is true because I was just like stuck in the rut of the negativity. But then Kym also would always bring in a layer of personalization and positivity and that emotional authenticity part. And there's a thing, a lot of people talk in the social media world of this moment of that parasocial relationship that your audience has with people who are public figures. And that was something that we were in some ways trying to intentionally stoke. Was like, we want you to feel like it's a real person writing to you what we really are thinking about and feeling this week. And if you're feeling this way, then you're not alone. And if you want to know what you can do about it, then here's some things you can do about it. And then always we ended every week's message with 2 examples of finding joy, because in the face of destructive authoritarian government, joy is resistance. They are trying to take your happiness away, and your ability to find happiness and perpetuate it is a direct refutation of authoritarianism. And so that was the formula. What would you add?
I think I come from a legal writing background, and so I always bring maybe a little more structure to Graig's writing, a little more clarity, and I think it's really important. There's so much to say right now. You have to pick one theme, and that would be something that we would work on a lot to help something be a little more clear is how do you organize all of these crazy thoughts and everything that's happened this week, and how do you build it around one theme? But the reason we started doing this was, it's hard to think about now because we're in such a better space, but in February of last year, people had given up. The amount of apathy that was out there, people were, I'm exhausted, we've been through this once,
And law firms and universities were rolling over to the government.
People were caving, but people were also just saying, you know what, I'm taking some self-care, I'm just gonna have a bubble bath and read a book, and I'm like, okay, great, and then you gotta get out of the bath and go organize, because the only way to get through this is through it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the emotional kind of personal piece that you all put to your writing. You called out my vacuums and gavels piece, and I think that's one of my better writings. But in that piece, I talk about this relatability, and I say that near the end of it, I think people relate more to me cleaning toilets than they do cutting ribbons. And I think that's something that people can really attach on to. And so often I think politics is storytelling, right? And so you tell this story and then you relate it back to a policy, right? And I think Democrats maybe don't do that super well these days. I'm not sure that we connect super well. And I think a lot of times we get called weird, right? And I think us at this table, we're the exception to the rule there, right? We're not weird.
Not weird.
Yeah, we're not weird at all.
I'm not weird. Put that on the record.
Yeah,
Keep Boone weird.
A very normal guy.
We're the exception to that. But do you think Democrats are weird? Would you define Democrats as weird today?
My biggest critique of Democrats on the communications front would be that they always want to argue with your head and they don't want to connect to your heart and your gut. Yeah. And that is weird because that's not how you relate to people. Like, you don't talk to your friends or your family just by trying to tell them I have a better idea than you and you should listen to me and vote for me because of how good my ideas are. Like, nobody relates to normal people that way. And if somebody does come in and treat you that way, you're like, you're an asshole, like, get out of here.
And that point about regular people, like, humor and joy is what wins over regular people. Right. I always thought so. My dad never had health care growing up and actually had this huge accident, nearly cut off his foot. Tried to drive himself to the ambulance or the hospital. Tried to ignore the ambulance to get to the hospital, missing most of his foot. An insane story. He's also like one of the funniest guys you'll ever meet. And he's made that joke where he's like, Dalton, if somebody came to my door and wanted to talk to me about how bad healthcare was with stats, he was like, I would slam the door in their face.
Right.
And he's got this approach to it that is so funny. But if you were to go to his door and be like, look how ridiculous this is, right? And just try to connect with him, you would win him over. And this is a guy that didn't graduate high school, rural North Carolina. Like, these are the people that we've lost. And I think that joy piece and that humor piece is really how we win over regular people. And I think about just recently, we won on the Hill this past week on the ESA, and we went to a national
What's
game.
the ESA? Tell them what the ESA
The Endangered Species Act, shout out 1973. And we went to the Nationals game after. I got a couple of environmental advocates that are so used to losing, or at least playing
Right.
defense. And the whole time I had this giant beer at the Nationals game versus the Braves, and I just kept doing this bit about the radical right cannot stand the fact that we're having a cold beer, watching baseball, and saving the environment. And it was a bit.
Exactly.
But everybody's, we need to put that on a shirt. That's hilarious. And I think about that as being just a bedrock of let's not take ourselves seriously. Let's be authentic to who we are. And if that makes us a little bit more approachable, I think we're all the better for it.
And say what you mean. I think that's something that we really emphasize. There's so much of like poll testing to find the right word or whatever, and it ends up in this super wishy-washy place. Like we're talking about, oh, don't say climate, say whatever.
Yeah.
Just use plain language and say exactly what you're talking about. And that's something I've actually had to push Graig on, because he's coming from this political space where he's, I don't want to annoy these people, or you're trying to find this happy middle. And it's no, just power through.
Yeah. I feel like we've gotten so far away from just having like kitchen table conversations like we're having right now. We don't do that super well. And it was really frustrating during the 2024 elections when, to your point, talking about data, I feel like Democrats kept on saying, look at the data, inflation's going down, like costs are going down. But to me, that felt like a slap in the face, because I go to the grocery store, right? And so when I was at the grocery store, it was still expensive. And I'm like, you're giving me this data point, but my data point is my bank account, and my bank account says otherwise, right? And so that was super frustrating for me. And so I come from a really red county in Henderson County, conservative county, and it's making some headway turn to the left. But to the point about kitchen table conversations, is I think if I was running for state house or state senate, 9 times out of 10, the people in my community probably would disagree with me. But when I was running for mayor, and I'm really talking about these issues that really touch people, and I went around literally having like front porch conversations. Like I knocked on thousands of doors in Fletcher and talked with people about the issues that they care about. And it made the difference in plain language, to your point. You talk to these people with plain language, not jargon, not giving a dissertation about something that doesn't need a dissertation. And it really wins them over. And you get that emotional piece, and you get that policy piece, and you really connect with people.
That's it. That's where the idea for Beacon Media came from. So when I first started representing Caswell County, so I'm from Chapel Hill, liberal, highly educated. Caswell County is rural and one of the least educated counties in the state. But I had been writing a monthly column for my local newspaper, and so I started sending it to Caswell County too. I didn't change what I was writing about. I didn't change who I was. I didn't try to adapt to represent Caswell County. And what I found out was that people would come up to me in the grocery store, on the street, or wherever in Caswell County, and say, hey, you're the guy that writes to us about what's happening at the state. And sometimes they didn't even realize I was their legislator. They just were used to it, and they see my picture, right? But sometimes they wouldn't. They would say, I got to tell you, I don't agree with everything that you write, but I agreed with this one piece because you said this, and that really connected with me, and blah, 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 blah. So that taught me some things. One, that they weren't watching the main sources of state news. They weren't getting it from the big state news sources. They weren't hearing about what's happening at the state level. Two, because it wasn't coming from like the cable news, red versus blue thing, but it was written in their local paper. They were willing to look for the common ground, even if they didn't agree on everything. And so that created this idea of Beacon Media of, we need to be showing up more persuasively in all of these community media sources, talking to people about their local issues, but from a values perspective, and giving us opportunities to find common ground, but also to persuade people to new things. So that leads to Beacon wanting to support you all with Do You Even Live Here, a regional podcast from 2 young folks in leadership positions, but trying to figure out what's best for your community. You're not going to get rich off your jobs. You're not going to get rich off this podcast. But if there's a way to amplify your voices so that more people in Western North Carolina can figure out what are we asking for, and what are we demanding out of our elected officials, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, then that's how you get to persuasive power. It's persuasive communications.
Well, and show people that regular folks can do this job, and that you don't have to be this image of a Senate candidate or a mayor to be involved. We had
You could be a janitor or a hippie.
Yeah, exactly.
Conservationist.
We had a young 25-year-old reach out to Preston and say, I'm exploring running for office. I listened to the show and was really inspired by just the fact that you two approach this in the way that you do. And I think that those types of things, I will say, y'all's Substack has become statewide. When you mentioned me and Preston in it, very briefly, should have been more of a shout out. Very briefly, somebody that was a constituent, they like shared it and were like, Graig Meyer is talking about our mayor, Dalton George. It was like getting your art on the fridge. Your mom put your art on your fridge. Y'all have really made an incredible impact with that. And people in my community trust what you're saying. And I think it's because of your point of that authenticity and talking about what's real.
And one thing that helps us a lot, so we have a blended family of 6 kids who range from 11 to 33. And we have those around the table conversations with them.
Yeah.
And there is nothing like, none of them are like deeply steeped in any of these things, but they have their values, they have the things they care about, and they have a lot of questions. And figuring out how to communicate to them, and they're very cynical about anything we have to say as well, probably more than anyone in the world, has been just so helpful for us to be able to articulate things on a kind of like really straightforward basis.
It's great practice. It's the dad test I talk about. If I'm talking to my dad and I'm talking about the Endangered Species Act or something and it's going over his head, I'm like, okay, I probably need to figure out how to talk about conservation in a better way. I don't have to hire a consulting group or whole 20 people. It's like there's regular folks in your life that you care about, that you could talk about your values, whether it's climate change, whether it's conservation, affordability, whatever. And if they're like, you're way over my head, Graig or Kym or Dalton or Preston, it's okay, I need to figure out how to talk about this better. And it's really interesting because it doesn't take a lot.
Yeah, that's right. You know, I think one of the great things about being an elected official, too, especially a local elected official, and Dalton, you can tell me if you agree with me or not, it's like we, and I think this is obvious, but we're the leaders of our community, and we are the people that people just intimately trust and know in our communities. And so when we communicate things to them, there's almost like this inherent trust that already exists. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I love like what you're talking about here, Graig. And it's like, if we can communicate our values, because these people have already shown that they trust us.
They want to know what you think.
They've elected us to office. Yeah. And so even if they might not agree with us on the climate or whatever it may be, they'll listen to us, and I think they'll give us a shot, and they'll try to hear where we're coming from. And that's why I think the work that you're doing and the work that we're doing here is just so incredibly important, right? Because we are those messengers. We are those leaders in those communities. And so when we say, hey, maybe we don't need to vote for this person, maybe give this other person a chance, and here are the 10 pillars or the 10 reasons why, it really chips away and it makes that difference in Henderson County or Watauga County or Orange County.
Preston, just made me think about a lesson that I did learn in the legislature, which was I was a constant thorn in the side of the Republican majority, but I also was able to work together with them on certain things. And the reason why was because they always knew I was talking straight to them about what I really believed. I wasn't trying to manipulate anything. And so if I came to somebody on the side and I said, hey, your bill is generally a good idea, but these things in it are going to have some harmful impacts, and can we work to figure that out? They knew I wasn't trying to manipulate them because I was someone who always just said what I believed, and they could choose to disagree with me or agree, but on the places where we would agree, even if it was only 25% of the time, they knew they could work together with me. And the same thing would be true for you as a mayor. People won't agree with you 100% of the time, but they do want to know where they do agree with you.
Exactly. I had an interesting experience, and I think this really speaks to your point. And so I had somebody I used to serve with on my council. She called me the other day, and we were talking about this issue that we've been trying to work on for a really long time. And we just get to talking, like we're good friends now. This person's a Republican and always shows up to all her local GOP meetings, whatever. And she was like, oh, yeah, we were talking about you at the Republican GOP headquarters. I was like, oh, boy. I was like, how was that conversation? And she was like, it was good. Yeah. We told them how easy you are to work with, and you genuinely try to do the right thing. And I was like, oh, I appreciate that.
That's what you want.
Yeah. I hope you say the same things about me. And I was like, I do. I appreciate that. I do. This is somebody I used to serve with. And we even had this piece where I always talk about this incident we had in Fletcher where somebody unfortunately lost their life. We had a in custody death. And years before that, as I served on council and as I served as mayor, I always push for body-worn cameras for our officers. I'm like, this is a common sense thing. It's a benefit for the officers, but it's also a benefit for the public. There's accountability both ways. And each year it was, no, we're not going to do that. We don't need that. We're a good department, and we are a great department. I stand behind our police officers. We're a great department. But then it got to the point where it just started chipping away, and we had this incident, and then we funded it. And they were like, Preston, you were right. We need to do that. And so they eventually saw where I was coming from. They believed in me. They gave me their trust. The community gave me their trust. But this is exactly what you're talking about. You just chip away and you build these relationships with the folk in your community, and they trust you. That's why they put you there, to make those decisions.
And you have to be an ambassador for an issue, even if it's not popular, to our point about climate change. We recently, in the police team, adopted a social work program that's embedded in our police department. It was something I was really pushing for. And there was a resistance up front, and now we've adopted it, and it's become really successful. The governor actually sent a team out to look at it, to model that in other rural, small towns. So I'm proud of that as a real policy win, but it's like the police officers like it because they're like, it's great to have somebody that can respond to somebody in crisis and help us navigate it and not be tied up on calls. And you think about the environment 3 or 4 years ago when I first started talking about it, it was not really maybe the issue that folks saw as popular, or it was more controversial. And now we're at a place where it's 99% of people are like, this is better for everyone. And
I was a police embedded social worker for 3 years.
Really?
Yeah.
In Chapel Hill?
Yeah, in Chapel Hill. Every police department should have an embedded social work team.
Wow.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about communicating. I know that this segment is getting towards the end, but I would be remiss. You talked about you being a straight shooter, not wanting to manipulate the narrative. And we're in downtown Asheville in an Asheville studio, and this salacious New York Post article just came out. Have y'all seen that? No. And it is just, Asheville is terrible. It really plays up this kind of homeless people are everywhere, right? This is what a liberal-run city does in the wake of the hurricane. And it's fascinating to see, I think, some people use communications, use these kind of narratives that are really powerful, and go after communities in some ways. And it sounds like I haven't read the article, but I was just curious as how do y'all combat misinformation and folks that are using that kind of form of communication and trying to kidnap narratives, right? And use them in ways that maybe aren't honest or authentic, but are manipulating the public.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge for our age, right? And with AI, it's only going to get more terrifying and more of a problem. And that's really where you come back to something like Beacon. I think people are starting to lose trust. We know they are. People are starting to lose trust in major news outlets, major leaders, what they read on the internet. And that's frustrating, but it also just causes us to adapt. And I think it makes those local voices all the more important, that you're going to listen to what your neighbor says more than hopefully what the New York Post says. But I think we're only at the beginning of this problem, unfortunately. Graig, what do you think?
I just would add, I think you have to decide what you amplify and what you don't. Like, if someone says something nasty about you and you don't want anybody else to hear it, then don't refute it because you don't want to repeat the base message. Asheville should just ignore the stupid New York Post article. Asheville gets a lot of positive press, like ignore that piece. But where there are things that are, I think, factually inaccurate and risk building power against you, then you have to have a direct counter narrative.
Right.
And to the point we have being direct, not an indirect counter narrative.
Or make a joke, to your point about humor earlier.
Yeah.
I think this is a prime example of where you could spoof it. I mean, it's so absurd. This is such a paradise for so many people.
Well, we saw it briefly even in the wake of the hurricane, where so many influencers that were talking about what government was or wasn't doing were funded by political agencies like Matt Von Swell of Nashville. And it was really interesting for me as somebody that was doing hurricane relief work and didn't have time to get on Twitter and talk. Like, I was out helping people, bringing people medication, doing actions after the hurricane. And you log onto your phone 2 weeks later, dog tired, and here's some clown that has been live tweeting it with a counter narrative. And that was a unique dynamic because it really showed the whole theme of this segment, which is if you're not communicating, which so few people that were doing the good work were communicating because they were doing the good work. But he's going to fill that void.
Isn't that such a terrible dynamic that the people who are doing the work don't have time to communicate? The people who all they have to do is communicate are often being funded by people who aren't doing any good work. And also you're at a disadvantage to people who are manipulative media folks, for sure.
Yeah. That has been the communication piece, talking about this, which is a huge well of Do You Even Live Here? I am Dalton George, one of the hosts of this podcast, along with my co-host, Preston Blakely. We're talking to Graig Meyer and Kym Meyer, and we'll be back after the break with a few thoughts and closing.
Welcome back to the Do You Even Live Here podcast. I'm Preston Blakely, the mayor of Fletcher. I'm here with my co-host, Dalton George, the mayor of Boone, and we've had a wonderful conversation with Graig and Kym Meyer. And just to close things out, we've been partnering with Beacon Media on this project. And so, Graig, tell us what Beacon Media is. Give us the download.
Beacon Media is a nonprofit pro-democracy media organization. We are trying to spread values-based pro-democracy stories all across North Carolina. We syndicate columns every week to dozens of community newspapers. We're building up digital media properties like Do You Even Live Here, like this podcast, to try and get the same types of stories out there in the digital space. We just launched a local media organization in conjunction with Down Home, North Carolina, and Franklin and Granville counties. We hired a reporter, so we're going to build like a microsite to do local reporting there. We're really trying to figure out how do we make sure that there is progressive, values-based storytelling happening all across the state, specifically targeting places where the right wing is putting money into marketing and communications, and where the progressive side needs to do the same, and that would be rural communities, Black communities, and Spanish-speaking communities. We have a whole Spanish language arm called El Faro, which means the same thing as the beacon, the lighthouse, and they're doing digital media and getting ready to do some radio. We do all of our columns go out in Spanish as well as in English. And so it's a relatively new piece of the infrastructure. It's a project that's designed not to be focused on election cycles, but to be running all the time and to build up over the course of decades to the point that we have a strong media presence.
Wonderful. And why do you work with us? You touched on this a little bit. Why us?
We think it's important to be in the market where you are, which is in the rural Western North Carolina space. But most importantly, we want to find persuasive storytellers, and you two have such unique, powerful voices. You're already so good at starting with values-based communications, and then now we want to help you figure out how do you amplify that, how do you sharpen your voices. There's a piece of what we want to do, which is to develop folks who are community-based leaders. We don't want to, there's opportunities. If you're an elected official in Raleigh, you've got plenty of opportunities to communicate through the media. But if you're an elected official in Fletcher or in Boone, it takes a little bit of additional work to amplify your voices. And particularly with folks who have a lot to say but have never had anybody who works with you to learn how to get better at saying it. That's a piece of what we want to do as a nonprofit media organization.
Wonderful. Okay, AKA, I think what I'm hearing is that you love Dalton George and Preston Blake.
We do. We love you both, and we love both of your fine towns, Fletcher and Boone.
Wonderful. Boone more, though, right? That's what I heard.
He did. Y'all haven't visited Fletcher yet.
That's true. It's true. They're not allowed to vote on that.
I haven't been to the feed and see.
Yeah,
get to the feed and see.
As we prepare to wrap up, I'm very excited for what's next for you, Graig. I know that you're going to be able to accomplish some incredible things in your work post-legislature. And Kym, it's incredible the work that you do in the environmental space. I feel like you and I could peel off and have our own episode where we talk about all kinds of things. But I want to give you all a final opportunity to plug what's going on, what's next, how can people support each of y'all's work, and find out what you're doing.
Yeah, so what we're really focused on, the biggest thing right now, of course, is the Trump administration has rolled back a whole bunch of regulations and is continuing to do so that really are hurting this area, our forests here, our species here, our communities here in Western North Carolina, everything that makes this place special. And we'll be fighting in the courts. We've got lots of cases pending and some coming. And we always appreciate support. You can go to southernenvironment.org to learn more about our work.
And at the North Carolina Justice Center, we just introduced the People First Agenda, which is a legislative agenda focused on making sure that when our state makes decisions, both in policy and in budget, that the primary thing that we're doing is taking care of people. There's plenty of advocates in Raleigh for industries, business, corporations, et cetera. The Justice Center is trying to make sure that we have economic opportunity and opportunity for fair justice for people. We work on 6 major program areas: health access, education access, immigrants' rights, workers' rights, housing, environment, and transportation, which all kind of falls into the contemporary world of talking about affordability, but we're looking at the policies that are underneath them, and then fair chance criminal justice. And so we see how all of those things are related, that people live their lives not in policy silos, but with multiple policies that are impacting them, and we're trying to make sure that there is a voice in both public advocacy and in litigation for people who aren't represented by powerful interests. They're represented by the North Carolina Justice Center. Look us up online, and we would love to have your support and be in communication about the work that we're doing.
Excellent, y'all. And this, obviously, we'll do our plug now. This is Do You Even Live Here, a podcast partnered with Beacon Media, which Graig told y'all a little bit about. And we will go ahead and sign off. I'm Dalton George, and also is the Mayor of Boone, and my co-host.
I'm Preston Blakely, Mayor of Fletcher, and it's been a wonderful conversation with Graig and Kym Meyer.
Thanks for having us here, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, y'all.